thank you all three for amazing discussion. Thank you so much for your presentation. And right now, I would like to ask our guests, Dr. Kreider, Dr. Tarnopolsky, and Dr. Jeff Stout, if there are any other myths that you would like to mention or discuss and cover.
Yeah, Mark, could you add your comment that you put in the box here about women first?
Yeah, sure. So I just mentioned two studies that we did looking at creatine in men and women. The first was in young, healthy men and women that was published in MSSE in 2000. And we found that men gained more lean mass and more weight in response to creatine compared to women. The females gained 400 grams, but the important point was all of that was lean mass, and there was no increase in fat mass. Perhaps even more importantly is in the older adult population where sarcopenia is a big issue, and we've done lots of research. When we this was the Andrea Bro study that was published in 2003 in Journal of Gerontology, when we trained older adult males and females, the females gained almost 2 kilos of fat-free mass, but they lost 3 kilos of fat mass. So the ratio I think that most people are interested in is the ratio between our lean and our fat mass. And we've sort of colloquially called that the ripped ratio or the body composition index, which we're now using as an outcome measure in another study that we're doing with Michaela DeVries at University of Waterloo.
Thank you. Great point. And then what I want to do before we start into the questions is we have Dr. Tarnopolsky here, who's been involved in creatine research since 90s like ourselves or even earlier. And I think you've been to just about every one of these creatine conferences over the years, helped organize the 2010 and 15 and others. And then we also have Dr. Jeff Stout, who also was one of the initial researchers. So our question is, after hearing a lot of the presentations this week, where do you think the state of the science is on creatine and what needs to be done from this point forward?
Sure. So I thought it was a fantastic meeting. I missed a few of the meetings because we had a few other things going on, but it's outstanding. I think what we're seeing is it's pretty clear that creatine monohydrate is the compound, and chemical modifications really are not going to likely enhance the benefit, which pretty much makes sense. I think we've studied it for so long, and we also know how safe it is. I think the safety is coming out quite clearly in the numbers of studies. One of the things that I think is needed are larger studies, and the problem, of course, is that when we look at things like Parkinson's disease, cardiovascular disease, and we look at drugs, so pharma companies doing drugs, they're having 3,000-4,000 people sometimes in each arm of their studies to detect a significant difference. And to some extent, I think this area is shooting themselves in the foot when we do studies with small numbers and we sort of say, oh, wow, it didn't show anything, even though there's strong trends. So it would be really nice if we could do some more multi-centered studies. It would be nice if there was more funding for research so that we could get the numbers, because I really think that the effects that we're seeing with creatine in many areas, cognition, neuroprotection, cardiovascular potential benefits, et cetera, are really quite strong. And I think we're just underpowered to detect the effect. So clearly, I know everyone finishes a conference with this comment, more studies are necessary, but I think here we have so much potential that I think the next 10 years are going to be pretty exciting, especially if we all work together.
Thank you. Jeff, do you have some comments?
Mark took exactly what I was going to say about expanding the potential of all of our lab collaborating on a single project. A lot of the research that we presented on the medical rehabilitation, you can see there's trends, but all of those studies are underpowered. And if we were able to do like a multi-center type of trial, even among us, to get the numbers up on any of the, like Kylie mentioned during her presentation, she thinks and we think that creatine has the potential for many, many different conditions, even the ones that we didn't see like ALS and stuff like that, but the sample size is just way too small to tell. And like Mark said, and even in big pharma companies that do nutritional trials like Abbott, when they look at HMB, they're doing 7 site, studies, and it's, a couple $1 million, and they're seeing this tiny little, result. Whereas with creatine, like Mark said, there's such a huge effect size that if we had something similar, we would see something very powerful.
Yes, great, thanks. And I want to address one more kind of myth that we've all dealt with. I think back in the early 2000s, several of us wrote a letter in response to the French suggesting there may be a link of creatine to cancer, and every 5 or 10 years it seems to come back up. And even though we heard some presentations yesterday about the potential cancer reducing effect or anti-tumor growth effect of creatine, you still see this in the literature. Every once in a while a study comes out in animals, and in this last spring we had one that came out in Cell Metabolism that many of us contributed to a letter to the editor. But Mark, since you're an MD and PhD, could you talk to us about the impact of misleading information about potential health risks and how that may limit the application in the medical community, and what we can do to try to safeguard that?
Yeah, no, it came into sharp focus for me when we were doing a Muscular Dystrophy Association sponsored study in boys with Duchenne dystrophy. So Duchenne dystrophy is a horrible disorder. People at that time were dying in their mid-20s of this disorder. And we had a lot of evidence in mice that creatine was a benefit. And we were in the middle of a randomized double-blind crossover study. And I remember going up the elevator when that paper you're referring to came out, and an MD PhD who is in the population health research group, who you think would know better, said, I heard that there was this randomized trial showing that creatine caused cancer. And I, choked. I said, geez, I don't remember that. So I went and saw what he was referring to. And it was essentially a commentary about the potential, if you take creatine and sugar and you cook it at high temperatures, that you can get some carcinogens that are formed. And it's that degree of misinformation, which I hate to say it, is perpetuated by big pharma because they don't want creatine to work because it takes away from their market share. And when I can see that someone who's so educated could believe from a commentary that creatine caused cancer and ignore the real research, it made me very disheartened. But what's pretty clear to me, and I was there with you, Rick, at many of these meetings, when we saw some of the very well done studies showing that creatine actually had an anti-tumor effect. My wife, who's here with me now as a pathologist, did some work in young kids with leukemia. And part of the treatment for leukemia is to use corticosteroids. And there's a very strong evidence that creatine may have a beneficial effects to prevent some of the deleterious effects of corticosteroids. And our ethics committee, when we presented them with the data, was sufficiently convinced that there's no evidence whatsoever of creatine causing cancer. So they allowed us to go forward, and we've been using it now for 30 years in MD patients, and and there's millions of people throughout the world using creatine. If there truly was an effect of creatine causing an increased risk of cancer, it would rise to the surface, and these reports would come through to the FDA, and a health signal would emerge, which it has not in almost 30 years of use.
Thank you. So at this point, we'll open it up to questions. So we'll have Dr. Kochi give us the questions to the panel.
Thank you very much. So our first question is going to be for Dr. Baker. We have heard many times that the consumption of creatine supplements may be contraindicated in patients with kidney disease. Could you explain what is the reason for this belief? Thank you.
This belief is a consequence of the fact that creatine is non-enzymatically converted to creatinine. And creatinine is used as a measure of kidney function as well. So it's the circulating concentration of creatinine is in fact on one side the marker of muscle mass and the creatine content of the body, and on the other side of kidney function. That creatinine is rising in response to consumption of creatine that's not a marker of kidney dysfunction. It should be measured, yeah, without supplementation to be judging it. In fact, so it's a misunderstanding, I think.
Well, that I can chime in on that because Rick and I and Mark probably were back in the early 2000s, late 90s. Lancet published a paper on a 25-year-old man that had like kidney problems. Remember that? And he was having relapsing steroid responsive to nephrotic syndrome. Anyways, they noticed he was taking creatine. Physician took him off the creatine, and he's like, it relieved all of the symptoms, right? Well, then 3 days, literally 3 days, another French paper then went out and said creatine, reported creatine supplementation can impair kidney function. So they're talking about somebody who had severe kidney issues taking creatine, and now they're saying that everybody should not take creatine at all. And they said it impaired kidney function. And previous studies found that creatine supplementation had, just doesn't work. And it was amazing. But unfortunately, things like that, and also the New York Times wrestler data where they showed severe dehydration and death, those myths just keep on living, and people continue to talk about how creatine causes cramping. And there's been great studies, especially the one by Volek, showing that, kind of dispelled that whole myth of redistribution of intracellular and extracellular water. So anyways, it's a myth that keeps on giving.
Yeah, that will always be the case with those kind of things, because it's used as a marker of kidney function, and as long as creatinine is used as a marker of kidney function without other markers, then it is a problem. You have muscle mass independent markers of kidney function. They should be measured in adjunction to the other markers, but that will take time before that is will be common sense.
That has been published, though. So the late, great Jacques Poortmans published 2 papers. One was acute creatine supplementation. The second was the longer-term effects. And what he showed in the first paper was that using independent measures or proper measures of creatinine clearance, that it's not deleteriously affected. And we've also used 24-hour urine creatine collections to show that with creatine supplementation, there was no impairment of true kidney function. So the problem is, as was pointed out, is that when creatine is used as a convenient marker of renal function, it works if you don't change the rate of appearance of creatinine into the pool. But when RA of creatinine goes up, which it does because you increase muscle mass, you increase the non-enzymatic breakdown, of course, and you don't change RD, which is glomerular filtration rate, then concentration must go up. It's simple.
It's like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll add our 21-month safety study in Division I college football players. We compared creatine users versus non-users, and we looked at renal function and lots of things. And of course, creatinine levels went up because these are large muscle mass individuals doing very heavy training, a lot of times in hot and humid environments. But the control group had higher creatinine levels than the creatine group. And the glomerular filtration rates with looking at renal function were not affected by creatine supplementation, even when taking 10 grams a day for 21 months in very highly trained athletes. So it's another misnomer. Unfortunately, we have to deal with this every once in a while. And probably the funniest one I remember is somebody presenting a paper at ACSM, and they got up there and we had a case study of renal dysfunction with creatine, and it went on. And they mentioned that the version of creatine they used was creatine serum. And as you heard earlier with Ralph Yeager, there's no creatine in creatine serum. So I'll never forget, Anthony Amato says, are you aware there's no creatine in creatine serum? Yet you're attributing these effects to creatine supplementation. It's like, oh, never mind. But that's still in the literature out there that people will bring up.
It's a bit of an anecdote, but we do have to publish this. Our government, based on research that we've done, has approved a multi-nutrient supplement for our patients with mitochondrial disorders. So we've been giving this now to our MELAS patients. That's a very severe mitochondrial disease now for almost 30 years. And these patients are at risk for renal dysfunction. And we have about 250 patients who've been taking it for more than a decade. And if anything, there's renal protection. So we don't have a single person who has developed renal failure, and yet we should have at least 10% who did, but not one has. Now, I don't know how much of that is our mitochondrial enhancer, but at least taking 5 to 7 grams of creatine a day for decades in patients predisposed to renal dysfunction, we found no evidence of it whatsoever. If anything, it's protective.
Perfect. The next question is for all the speakers, please. Have you tried any specific protocol to improve symptoms of post-COVID fatigue and depression?
I didn't.
I think Serge had written a paper on a theoretical use, but I don't think any research has been done to examine that I'm aware of.
It
Yeah, I
makes
would
some
agree.
sense. Yeah.
I would agree. It needs to be done. There's a little bit of data in central fatigue or chronic fatigue syndrome, but not a whole lot. But there is some very fascinating data out of Perry Renshaw's group in Utah, where they've taken people with taking antidepressive medications that were not responsive to those medications and provided creatine and acetylcholine, and together that seemed to enhance the reduce the depression. And there's a paper that looks at creatine in the diet and has been linked to low levels of creatine in the diet seem to have greater depression incidence in large scale NHANES level databases. So Mark, do you have any comments with that?
Well, certainly when you look at MR spectroscopy data on patients with major affective disorder or bipolar affective disorder, you can see that there's alterations in CNS phosphocreatine and mitochondrial metabolism, and that's fairly well established. So given the nice discussion we had earlier showing the evidence for improvements of mitochondrial function and the ability to load brain creatine, I think the data would suggest that this is something that really needs to be further investigated, because SSRI medications, which is the most popular drug which is currently used, are effective still not even in the majority of patients. So clearly we need other therapies that could be added. And certainly, as Rick pointed out, there's good evidence for the synergy between SSRIs and creatine, and probably mitochondrial enhancers. Of course, I'm a little mitochondrial centric in my view of the world, but I do think that it's an important thing, which also is likely to be benefited from creatine supplementation.
Thank you very much. Our next question is also for all of you, please. What databases can we consult to validate that the different creatine supplements contain creatine monohydrate? Thank you.
I'll go ahead and take a first stab on that one, since I was a co-author, lead author on that bioavailability paper. What I look for is creatine monohydrate, because that's what 99% of the studies have been conducted on with creatine. And then I also look for a pure version. And right now, the best available pure source is CreaPure from Germany. And so that's what I look for. If somebody's selling a different type of creatine, I want to know what percentage of creatine it is to the total molecule. And you actually can go on PubChem and determine the molecular size of creatine versus the other constituents and get a ratio, a percentage ratio estimate. But that doesn't validate that it would dissociate if it's bound together. So the other issue is you need to look at, does it increase the blood level? Does it increase tissue level? And is there any data on efficacy with that particular supplement? And if it shows some benefit, okay, then the next question, is it less affordable or more effective than creatine monohydrate? And if you recall, we had a presentation yesterday or the day before, and there was a cost assessment of some of those different sources of creatine out there, and they're much, much more expensive. And so one of the nice things with creatine monohydrate is that there's been such a large utilization of creatine monohydrate that the prices are very low. We're talking pennies per gram. And so for a very small amount of cost to a supplement, you can add some high quality creatine monohydrate and get some of these benefits that we've talked about through this meeting. Scott or Jeff, do you have any other comments for that?
I agree.
can jump in. So yeah, so I totally agree with Dr. Kreider's comments that creatine monohydrate is the safest, it's the most effective supplement. And then my favorite part of all of it is that it's the cheapest. I'm really cheap. I like to save a lot of money. And that's why I always recommend creatine monohydrate.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your responses. And the next question is actually for you, Dr. Scott Forbes. How can training experience in older adults modify the benefits of creatine supplementation? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of the research has been done on untrained participants, particularly in older adults. So I'm not aware of any research that's directly compared trained versus untrained in that aging population. But I know for younger individuals that there's lots of evidence to show that both trained individuals can respond to creatine supplementation and untrained as well. So it seems to be an effective supplement to enhance both trained participants, elite athletes, and also recreational or naive trained participants as well.
Thank you very much. Our next question is please for all of you, all the speakers. So in terms of absorption or bioavailability, should any changes be made to the dosage or dosing recommendations for individuals who have undergone weight loss surgery like gastric sleeve or gastric bypass?
The challenge with the bariatric surgery procedures is that they seriously reduce the volume of the stomach. So, you know, when you're first done, many bariatric procedures leave you with the volume of the stomach about as big as this iPod that I have here. So it's very, very small. So it is likely that smaller doses taken multiple times throughout the day would be the best way, or the only practical way of actually getting creatine in your diet. What's very interesting, and we're very involved in this research now, is it's pretty clear that with both GLP-1 receptor agonists, which are the most popular weight loss supplement, and bariatric surgery, that there is a dramatic loss of lean body mass when you take the supplement or get the surgery. In fact, with bariatric surgery, it's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. So for every pound of fat mass loss, you lose a pound of lean mass loss. And so therefore, it is very likely that creatine would be an incredibly effective countermeasure for the lean body mass loss in those who take GLP-1 receptor agonists and or undergo bariatric surgery. And we're doing lots of work in that area.
Thank you very much. Our next question is also for all of you, please. In the creatine timing studies, how long after the workout did the post-workout group take the creatine?
I guess I'll jump in. Does somebody else want to jump in? Generally, when you want to take creatine after workout with carbs and with protein to try to enhance the response to the exercise. If you take creatine with carbohydrate, not only does the creatine uptake enhance because creatine uptake is glucose dependent, but also it enhances glycogen storage. And if you add protein, there's been studies with protein or just carbohydrate and carbohydrate protein, you get also the advantage of adding some additional amino acids for protein synthesis. So what we always told our athletes and have done studies with is once you're loaded, and that's the goal, is to load and get an ergogenic benefit quickly, then take it with your post-workout carbohydrate protein supplement within an hour or two after you work out. We think that that's a good timing to try to enhance glycogen resynthesis and protein synthesis, and also have your creatine maximized in uptake afterwards. Jeff or Scott, do you have any suggestions with that?
Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, so we've conducted a few timing studies, and when we look at pre versus post, we typically give it as close to the exercise training session, either pre and then post within 5 minutes following the exercise session. And when we look at the differences between pre versus post supplementation, there's none. So it might come down to co-ingestion. So as Dr. Kreider suggested, combining creatine with either carbohydrates or protein to either increase glycogen resynthesis or to enhance the uptake of creatine, that may be more important than combining it either before exercise or after exercise. It might be more important to just consume creatine, but maybe consume it with other macronutrients.
I think the important thing is just consume it.
Thank you very much.
Just one point. So certainly with our muscular dystrophy studies and with our older adult studies, we told them to take it anytime during the day without any specific reference to whether they were exercising or not. And at the end of 4 months, for example, in our studies, or 3 months in the BRO study, the creatine levels were maximally loaded. So, you know, I think the most important thing is just get it in you whenever it's convenient. But clearly, I agree with Rick, and there's no question that in the short term, there are ways to enhance it post-exercise and with carbohydrate and probably with protein. So if you have to get there quickly, yeah, that would probably get you there faster. But over a long period of time from a health perspective, I think the most important thing is just find a strategy that works for you and just, you know, make sure you're taking the recommended dose.
Thank you. Another question is, again, for all of you, please. Is creatine a reliable biomarker to determine kidney function? What would be the most useful and practical markers in clinical practice?
Yeah, so
Creatine is not a marker for kidney function. It's creatinine, the breakdown product of creatine. If you would like to know kidney of muscle mass independent kidney function markers, it would be cystatin C. That's a well-known muscle mass independent kidney function marker. And from the animal science, it's symmetric dimethylarginine. That's also an emerging muscle mass independent kidney function marker.
Clinically, the other things to look at that are available in you know, any family doctor's office would be to look at microalbuminuria. So certainly in diabetics and older adults, that's one marker that's very commonly available to every family physician, which is one indicator of function. The best way, if you're taking creatine, would be to measure urine excretion as well. So you can truly calculate creatinine clearance, because when you get creatinine and then in your report to the family doctor, it calls it creatinine clearance. It's just an equation. So it's a standard equation. They put it in, and it's really not measuring creatinine clearance. The only way to do that is to do the blood versus urine measurements.
Thank you very much. And our last question, again, for all of you, please. What interaction could creatine monohydrate have with people who drink alcohol beverages?
As far as efficacy of creatine impact, I'm not aware of any data showing that ingestion of creatine with or without alcohol would have any change of effect of creatine. However, we always recommend moderate alcohol intake. Mark, have you come across anything like that in the literature?
As you know, Rick, we did that study with mice, rats, and we had collected data on humans looking at, because originally, as you know, everything was being damaged by creatine, and the pharma companies loved all the negative press, but certainly liver failure and liver damage was one of the big ones. But I know your earlier studies in top sport athletes showed no evidence of it, and we did that lifelong study in rats and mice. Clearly, we found no evidence. Now, obviously, we all recommend moderation in alcohol consumption, and there is some evidence that excessive ethanol consumption is deleterious to exercise performance. So for anyone who wants to be fit, anyone who wants to be healthy, and everyone who wants to perform well, drinking to excess is never a good thing. So I would not recommend it.
And I would add, in that study that Mark mentioned, we looked at college athletes for 21 months. And not to be too revealing, there was some alcohol ingestion in that population that came up on our nutritional analyses, and we had to do a little bit of counseling on a few athletes, talk about how it could affect performance. So if there was going to be something seen with that study, probably would have seen it, because we were doing urinary output of creatine and creatinine and all those things to look at it, and we didn't find anything. So I'm not convinced there'd be a negative effect, although I completely agree with Mark's statements.
Thank you very much. So with all this being said, I would like to say thank you to all today's speakers. We really appreciate you were here with us. I also wanted to say thank you to all speakers from past 4 days. All 28 speakers. We really appreciate having you, and we've learned so much from you. Also, thank you very much to all of you participants who has joined us from 40 different countries. And the big thank you belongs to our coordinating team, the DBSS, and everybody who was working hard to make this event happen. And thank you so much, Professor Bonilla and Dr. Kreider, for amazing coordination. And before we say goodbye, we have prepared a video for you. And before we play the video, we would like to ask you if you would be willing to turn on your camera and smile at us so we can do screenshot, and then please enjoy the video. So thank you very much for turning on cameras. We really appreciate it. We have another chance to turn cameras on. Please, let's do that if you're still here with us. And thank you one more time for everything. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the day and the video.